What is a reasonable accommodation? A reasonable accommodation is a change or an adjustment to a job or work environment. This change permits a qualified person with a disability to participate in the job application process, perform the essential functions of a job, and/or enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment as other employees without disabilities in similar situations. Some examples of reasonable accommodation requests are modifications to a job application process. A person with a visual impairment might request the application in a format that can be read and completed with computer speech software. Modifications to a workplace. An employee who is deaf might request access to a relay service or other technology to allow her to make calls if her other coworkers are also required to make phone calls. Modifications to architectural barriers. An employee who uses a wheelchair might request a ramp for a lunchroom or office that has steps at the entrance. Modifications to a work schedule. An employee could request an afternoon shift if the circumstances of his disability cause him to be unable to work early in the morning. How to request a reasonable accommodation. To ask for a reasonable accommodation, you should request the reasonable accommodation in writing, although a verbal request is also legally sufficient to start the accommodation process. A sample letter can be found in our website. Submit the accommodation request to your Human Resources Department or supervisor. Also be prepared to provide a note from your doctor if your employer requests it. Your doctor's note should identify the diagnosis of your underlying disability, your disability-related limitations, and the accommodations that should help you overcome these limitations and perform the essential functions of your job. Keep a copy of your reasonable accommodation request and any supporting medical documentation for your records. An employer is obligated by law to enter into a discussion about a reasonable accommodation request within a reasonable time frame. It is unlawful for an employer not to respond to a request for an accommodation. However, they are not required to grant the requested accommodation if your accommodation needs can be met with a different but effective accommodation. My reasonable accommodation request was denied. What happens now? An employer can deny a reasonable accommodation if it believes the accommodation will cause an undue hardship. An undue hardship means a significant difficulty or expense. Undue hardship is determined on a case-by-case basis. For example, if an employee in a wheelchair requests larger access aisles in a convenience store, an employer, after research and construction costs, might say the accommodation would pose an undue burden. If the inconvenience of the accommodation is justified, however, the employer must work with the employee to find an effective, reasonable accommodation. In the case of the convenience store employee, the employer might offer her a job that does not require travel up and down the aisle as an effective, reasonable accommodation. Additionally, it is unlawful to retaliate against or harass any individual who has requested an accommodation. If you are facing difficulties with the accommodation process, retaliation, harassment, other forms of discrimination in employment, or have any other questions about the accommodation process, please contact the Disability Law Center. The DLC services are available throughout Utah and free of charge.